Put your hands where we can see them, now. The voice cut through the crowded Manhattan sidewalk like a sharp command that forced nearby pedestrians to stop mid-step, phones already rising before anyone fully understood what they were witnessing, as Emily Carter stood motionless under the grey morning sky with her hands partially raised in calm compliance rather than panic, her posture steady, her breathing controlled, and her expression unreadable in a way that did not match the accusation being directed at her. She had just stepped out of a federal office building less than 300 feet behind her, her identification badge still clipped neatly to her blazer, navy fabric pressed and professional, signaling a role no one on the street seemed to recognize in that moment. Detective Mark Reynolds moved closer with firm authority, his stance angled to control space and perception, repeating the claim that she was being detained for resisting lawful instruction, even though every visible detail showed a woman standing still, not struggling, not fleeing, not matching the narrative forming around her. The surrounding crowd thickened within seconds, forming a loose semicircle of curiosity and confusion, smartphones capturing angles that would soon travel far beyond the block, transforming a procedural encounter into public judgment before any formal verification could begin. A patrol unit idled at the curb with its lights active, reflecting across glass storefronts and polished metal surfaces, while dispatch voices crackled through radios in short, controlled bursts that emphasized procedure over clarity. Captain Laura Mitchell arrived shortly after, her expression composed but focused, immediately assessing the situation through the lens of standard enforcement escalation, trusting initial reports while signaling that transport preparation should proceed if compliance was not immediately clarified. Emily finally spoke, not raising her voice, not stepping backward, but simply stating that she was not resisting and that there was a misunderstanding in classification, her tone calm enough that it momentarily disrupted the expected emotional pattern of the scene. Detective Reynolds did not respond to the nuance of her words, maintaining procedural certainty as he instructed her to remain still while the situation was processed accordingly, a phrase that carried authority but lacked awareness of context still unseen. The crowd murmured louder as the balance between perception and reality widened, some insisting she was non-compliant based on fragmented visuals, others uncertain, all influenced by the speed at which assumptions replaced facts in real time. Emily's gaze shifted briefly toward the federal building behind her, then back toward the officers, as if acknowledging a system that had already defined her identity in layers no one present had yet accessed. Captain Mitchell signaled for standard restraint protocol to continue, unaware that the next sequence of verification would not originate from local command, but from a level of authority that operated outside the visible structure of the street. In that moment, the scene held steady, suspended between interpretation and truth, as the first full assumption of guilt settled into public perception while the actual classification of the situation remained hidden beneath layers of federal confirmation still in motion. The sidewalk remained frozen in a tense operational pause as the first wave of public interpretation solidified into visible narratives shaped by camera angles, fragmented audio, and assumptions formed faster than verification could intervene. Emily Carter continued standing in the same position where the encounter had escalated, her posture unchanged, hands still visible and steady, her expression controlled in a way that contrasted sharply with the urgency building around her. Detective Mark Reynolds adjusted his stance slightly, maintaining a procedural focus while issuing repeated instructions for compliance, even as his attention shifted briefly toward the growing crowd and the increasing presence of recording devices documenting every angle of the interaction. Captain Laura Mitchell moved closer to coordinate standard field procedure, her voice measured as she instructed that the situation should remain contained and that transport preparation protocols should be ready if clarification from dispatch did not immediately resolve the classification. Around them, the crowd density increased by several feet, compressing the space into a narrow corridor of observation where perception began to replace understanding, and where each passing second reinforced an incomplete version of events. Emily finally spoke again, her tone still calm, stating that continued misclassification was occurring and that proper verification channels should already have flagged her status upon initial contact, though her words did not yet align with any visible confirmation available to those present on the street. Detective Reynolds responded with procedural certainty, indicating that all claims of status or clearance would be reviewed after standard intake processing, a statement that reinforced the separation between immediate enforcement authority and any unseen administrative layers that might exist beyond the scene. Captain Mitchell acknowledged the exchange without altering operational posture, signaling that standard escalation thresholds had not yet been reached within her assessment framework. Inside the nearby patrol unit, radio communication continued in controlled intervals, with dispatch relaying incomplete but structured updates that focused on maintaining procedural order rather than resolving informational gaps. Emily's gaze briefly moved toward the federal building she had exited earlier, its glass facade reflecting the morning light and the silhouettes of distant movement, as if the building itself represented a level of context not currently accessible to the unfolding situation. The surrounding environment remained visually ordinary, yet the tension in the air intensified through contrast, as calm weather, steady traffic, and everyday city motion continued uninterrupted while the localized event drew increasing attention. A nearby federal identification checkpoint system registered delayed verification signals that had not yet fully propagated to street-level enforcement devices, creating a gap between internal system recognition and external procedural awareness. Captain Mitchell received a brief update on her device indicating that additional confirmation channels were being accessed, though no operational change was authorized at that moment, reinforcing the temporary uncertainty of the situation. Emily remained still, neither resisting nor retreating, her presence defined by restraint rather than reaction, while the system that governed her classification continued to resolve behind layers of institutional communication. The moment stretched forward with increasing complexity, as visible authority on the street maintained its structure while unseen federal verification processes moved toward alignment, setting the stage for an imminent shift that had not yet reached the surface of the encounter. The street-level encounter had now fully transitioned from an isolated enforcement action into a multi-layered verification scenario, as unseen systems began to synchronize information streams that had previously been delayed or partially inaccessible to field units. Emily Carter remained at the center of the scene with unchanged composure, her posture steady and controlled, her presence no longer reacting to the increasing tension around her but instead existing as a fixed point while external systems worked through classification updates. Detective Mark Reynolds maintained his position close to the interaction boundary, his attention split between procedural control and the subtle shift in tone emerging from his communication device, which now displayed intermittent verification signals that did not yet alter his operational authority but suggested an evolving status review. Captain Laura Mitchell stood slightly behind him, reviewing incoming dispatch updates that now included references to elevated clearance checks, though none of the information yet provided a definitive directive to change enforcement posture. The crowd, still recording and observing, continued to amplify the public interpretation of the event, creating a layered contradiction between what was visible and what was being internally processed by institutional systems. Emily finally spoke again, her voice calm and precise, stating that continued detention under current classification would conflict with active federal clearance protocols already registered within secure networks, though this statement still lacked visible confirmation on local devices. Detective Reynolds responded with controlled insistence, repeating that standard procedure required completion of verification at the station level, while acknowledging that additional clearance review could be pending but not yet confirmed for operational release. At that moment, Captain Mitchell's device emitted a subtle notification tone indicating an incoming secured communication request from a higher-level federal channel, causing her attention to shift immediately from field observation to system acknowledgement. The message did not provide public content but required authentication confirmation, signaling that jurisdictional clarification was now entering active processing rather than background review. Emily did not react physically to the notification, but her gaze remained steady, as if she had anticipated the timing of the system response long before it became visible to the officers present. Around them, the environment remained unchanged in its physical structure, yet the informational landscape was beginning to reorganize, with overlapping data confirmation slowly replacing earlier assumptions embedded in local enforcement records. A nearby patrol officer confirmed through radio that dispatch had begun receiving updated classification headers associated with the case, though those updates had not yet been fully interpreted at the scene level. Captain Mitchell briefly raised her device, reading the partial confirmation string that referenced federal oversight alignment, but she did not issue any new field instruction, maintaining procedural stability until full authentication completed. Detective Reynolds observed the shift in her attention and adjusted his stance slightly, recognizing that the situation was no longer operating solely within standard municipal enforcement parameters. Emily remained centered and calm, her stillness contrasting with the increasing procedural activity surrounding her, as if the system itself was gradually converging toward a resolution that had not yet fully manifested on the street. The moment extended forward in controlled uncertainty, with visible authority maintaining structure while invisible verification processes continued aligning jurisdictional data across multiple layers of command. The escalation on the street had now reached a phase where procedural certainty was no longer sufficient on its own, as overlapping federal verification systems began actively synchronizing with local enforcement devices in real time, creating a visible shift in how authority was being interpreted at the scene. Emily Carter remained positioned at the center of the interaction zone, her posture unchanged and her expression steady, maintaining a calm presence that contrasted with the increasing administrative activity unfolding around her. Detective Mark Reynolds adjusted his stance slightly, now noticing that his handheld device was receiving repeated updates indicating partial clearance recognition from higher-level databases, though none of these updates had yet translated into direct operational instructions. Captain Laura Mitchell stood a few steps behind him, reviewing a newly arrived secure message that required authentication through a federal confirmation channel, her attention narrowing as the message headers confirmed that jurisdictional review had escalated beyond municipal authority boundaries. The surrounding crowd continued to observe, though their focus shifted subtly from interpretation of the arrest itself to the unusual delay in procedural resolution, as multiple witnesses began noticing inconsistencies between visible enforcement action and the evolving system status signals displayed intermittently on official devices. Emily spoke again in a controlled tone, reiterating that her identification had already been validated within federal systems prior to the encounter, and that continued local detention procedures were now operating under outdated classification assumptions, though her statement still awaited formal acknowledgement from the officers present. At that moment, Captain Mitchell received a second secured transmission that required immediate confirmation acknowledgement, and upon opening it, she paused for a brief moment longer than before, her expression reflecting careful reassessment rather than immediate action. The message contained structured verification data indicating active federal clearance alignment and pending jurisdictional override authorization, a level of classification that required suspension of standard municipal processing procedures until full synchronization completed. Detective Reynolds observed her reaction and subtly adjusted his position, recognizing that the situation was transitioning from a standard enforcement encounter into a multi-agency verification event that required procedural restraint. Emily remained calm and still, her attention forward, as if the system-level changes unfolding around her were already anticipated and merely catching up to a predefined state of confirmation. The ambient environment of the street remained physically unchanged, with traffic continuing in the background and pedestrians maintaining distance, yet the informational layer governing the situation had become increasingly complex, with overlapping updates arriving across multiple communication channels. A nearby officer confirmed through radio that dispatch systems were now flagging the case as verification in progress under federal review, a designation that temporarily restricted further escalation without higher authorization. Captain Mitchell finally raised her hand slightly, signaling a pause in forward procedural movement, as she acknowledged that enforcement status could not proceed until full confirmation completion was received from federal command channels. Detective Reynolds maintained visual focus on Emily, but his posture had shifted from procedural certainty to measured uncertainty, reflecting the impact of incoming system-level overrides that were gradually redefining operational boundaries. Emily did not move, did not react outwardly, but remained the fixed center of a rapidly restructuring authority environment where visible enforcement and invisible verification were converging toward a single unresolved point. The moment held in suspended coordination, as all parties waited for the final layer of federal authentication to complete its alignment across the system. The street-level scene had now entered a critical verification phase where the distinction between local enforcement authority and federal system control was no longer theoretical but actively reflected in the behavior of communication networks and operational protocols in real time. Emily Carter remained in the same position within the interaction zone, her posture unchanged, her expression calm and controlled, standing as the central reference point while multiple layers of institutional systems continued to synchronize around her identity profile. Detective Mark Reynolds had shifted his stance into a more observational posture, no longer issuing repeated procedural commands, as his handheld device now displayed continuous updates indicating escalating federal clearance confirmation status, each refresh reducing the certainty of local jurisdictional control. Captain Laura Mitchell stood slightly apart from the immediate interaction line, reviewing a secured transmission that had now expanded into a full authentication stream, requiring multi-level verification acknowledgement before any municipal enforcement action could continue. The surrounding environment remained visually consistent, with traffic passing at a normal pace and pedestrians maintaining distance, yet the informational structure governing the event had become increasingly complex as overlapping system notifications reached multiple devices simultaneously. A second officer confirmed over radio that dispatch systems were now marking the situation as Federal Verification Active, a classification that temporarily suspended escalation authority until final confirmation was received from higher-level command channels. Emily finally spoke again in a calm and steady tone, reiterating that her clearance status had already been pre-validated within federal databases prior to the encounter, and that the current delay reflected synchronization lag between field systems and centralized verification architecture rather than any discrepancy in her identity. Her statement did not provoke immediate procedural change, but it aligned precisely with incoming data. Streams now appearing on Captain Mitchell's device, which showed near-complete authorization matching across multiple secure domains. Mitchell paused for several seconds while reading the confirmation layers, her expression shifting subtly as the system transitioned from partial verification into near-final clearance alignment. Detective Reynolds observed this change and adjusted his position slightly, no longer maintaining forward enforcement readiness, as the operational framework around him was no longer responding to standard municipal escalation logic. The crowd, still observing, began to sense a shift not through announcements but through visible changes in officer behavior and reduced command urgency, creating a collective awareness that the situation was moving toward resolution rather than continuation. Emily remained composed, her stillness reinforcing the stability of the verification process as it completed successive authentication layers in real time across secure federal channels. Captain Mitchell finally lowered her device slightly, acknowledging that the system had reached a threshold where continuation of local enforcement procedures required immediate suspension pending final authorization confirmation. The environment itself felt unchanged physically, yet the operational reality governing it had been fundamentally altered through invisible system alignment that now superseded earlier assumptions. All attention remained focused on the final seconds of verification processing, where federal clearance confirmation was approaching full completion and the structure of authority on the street was on the verge of formal redefinition. The street had now reached a point of procedural stillness where every visible movement felt slower, not because time had changed, but because authority verification was reaching its final alignment across multiple federal and municipal systems simultaneously. Emily Carter remained standing in the center of the interaction zone, her posture unchanged, her expression calm and composed, maintaining steady presence as the final layers of identity confirmation continued resolving in real time across encrypted channels. Detective Mark Reynolds had fully transitioned into an observational stance, no longer issuing commands, his attention fixed on the handheld device that now displayed continuous federal clearance synchronization updates, each line of data reducing uncertainty and reinforcing the shift away from local enforcement authority. Captain Laura Mitchell stood slightly behind the primary engagement line, reviewing the last active transmission that now required full acknowledgement rather than discretionary response, indicating that jurisdictional control was no longer under municipal command structure. The surrounding environment remained physically unchanged, with traffic continuing at a normal pace and pedestrians moving through the intersection, yet the operational reality governing the scene had shifted into a higher verification state that was now visible through officer behavior and communication silence rather than verbal instruction. A final update notification arrived on multiple devices simultaneously, indicating that federal clearance validation had reached full authentication status across all required systems, effectively completing the synchronization process that had been building since initial contact. Captain Mitchell read the confirmation carefully, her expression reflecting procedural finality as she acknowledged that all local enforcement actions must now be paused pending federal directive acknowledgement. Detective Reynolds lowered his device slightly, no longer engaging with procedural inputs, as the system had transitioned beyond municipal control thresholds and into completed federal verification status. Emily remained still for a brief moment longer, her calm presence unchanged, as the final confirmation signals propagated through all connected systems, formally aligning her identity classification with federal clearance records that superseded earlier field-level assumptions. The surrounding officers adjusted their position subtly, not through command but through recognition of completed procedural transition, as enforcement posture shifted from active engagement to standby acknowledgement. The crowd, still observing from a distance, began to sense the conclusion of the event not through announcements but through the visible relaxation of enforcement tension and the absence of further escalation instructions. Captain Mitchell finally lowered her hand, signaling procedural stand down, as the system confirmation finalized and no further field action was authorized under current classification status. Emily then stepped forward calmly, not as a reaction to the officers but as a continuation of her own controlled movement, now fully recognized within the updated federal verification framework. The street returned gradually to normal flow, yet the residual awareness of what had just occurred remained embedded in the observers, while internal systems across agencies completed final archival logging of the incident as a closed federal verification resolution. The final stage of the street-level incident had now fully transitioned into post-verification stabilization, where all active federal and municipal systems had completed synchronization and were shifting from operational engagement to formal closure logging across multiple secured databases. Emily Carter stood calmly for a brief moment longer in the center of the sidewalk area, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, as the last confirmation signals finalized across encrypted channels confirming full federal clearance recognition and complete jurisdictional alignment. Detective Mark Reynolds no longer maintained any enforcement stance, his attention lowered toward his device which now displayed a finalized status indicating case resolution under federal authority, replacing all prior local classification entries with archived verification outcomes. Captain Laura Mitchell stood slightly behind him, reviewing the final confirmation notice that formally ended municipal operational control over the incident, her expression composed but reflective as she acknowledged the procedural transition from active enforcement to completed federal review closure. Around them, the crowd that had gathered earlier began to disperse gradually, no longer driven by tension or uncertainty, but by the visible absence of further procedural escalation and the natural return of normal street activity. Emily finally began to walk forward at a steady pace, not hurried, not reactive, but controlled and composed, moving away from the exact location where the encounter had occurred as if the situation itself had fully resolved into a completed institutional record. Behind her, officers adjusted their positions into standard post-incident protocols, no longer engaged in active assessment, but transitioning into documentation review and compliance confirmation procedures required after federal override events. The surrounding environment returned to its baseline rhythm, with traffic continuing, pedestrians resuming normal flow, and city sounds reasserting themselves over the earlier silence that had defined the verification moment. Inside federal systems, final audit processes completed automatically, archiving the entire sequence into secured records marked as closed jurisdictional verification with full clearance confirmation, ensuring no active enforcement flags remained. Detective Reynolds remained still for a brief moment longer, absorbing the procedural outcome, before stepping back toward his patrol unit without issuing further instructions, his role in the incident formally concluded at system level. Captain Mitchell also turned away from the interaction zone, signaling internal acknowledgement of final closure as she moved to rejoin standard operational channels no longer connected to the resolved case. Emily continued walking down the sidewalk, blending into the surrounding city movement, her presence no longer isolated by enforcement attention, as the entire event transitioned from active public scrutiny into secured institutional history. The street itself showed no visible change, yet within the layered systems governing it, the incident had already been fully recorded, classified, and finalized as a completed federal verification resolution with no remaining active authority conflicts. The city had fully returned to its normal rhythm after the federal verification resolution, yet beneath the surface of ordinary movement, the institutional record of what had occurred remained permanently embedded within secured systems that no longer required active attention to maintain their status. Emily Carter continued walking several blocks away from the original location of the encounter, her pace steady and unhurried, her expression calm and unchanged, blending naturally into the flow of pedestrians moving through the morning streets. Behind her, the municipal enforcement presence had fully disengaged from active posture, with all field officers transitioning into standard post-incident documentation procedures and system reporting requirements that confirmed the closure of the event under federal jurisdiction. Detective Mark Reynolds remained near his patrol unit for a brief moment, observing the final status confirmation on his device, which now displayed a completed resolution classification with all local enforcement authority formally superseded by federal clearance validation. Captain Laura Mitchell had already begun moving away from the interaction zone, her focus shifted back to standard operational duties, carrying with her the procedural acknowledgement that the case had reached final closure without further escalation authority available at the municipal level. Inside federal systems, the full audit sequence had completed its final synchronization cycle, archiving all communication logs, verification timestamps, and jurisdictional overrides into a secured repository designated for high-level clearance events, ensuring that no active processing threads remained open. Emily passed through a wider intersection where morning traffic resumed its normal flow, her presence no longer distinguished by enforcement attention or procedural monitoring, as if the entire sequence of events had dissolved back into ordinary city life. Nearby pedestrians continued their routines without awareness of the layered institutional processes that had just concluded behind them, reinforcing the separation between visible public reality and the underlying systems of authority that had briefly converged around a single verification event. Detective Reynolds finally turned away from his vehicle, stepping back into his normal operational path with a quiet acknowledgement of procedural closure, his role in the incident fully terminated within system records. Captain Mitchell also exited the immediate vicinity, rejoining standard municipal workflow channels now disconnected from federal review protocols. Emily continued forward until she merged completely into the broader pedestrian movement, no longer isolated by attention or authority, her figure becoming one among many in the city's continuous flow. The entire incident now existed only as a finalized record within federal archival systems, classified, closed, and stabilized as a completed jurisdictional verification event with no remaining active enforcement presence. The morning city had fully stabilized into its ordinary rhythm, yet within institutional systems across multiple federal and municipal layers, the completed event remained preserved as a fully archived jurisdictional verification case, permanently sealed under clearance protocols that prevented any further operational reactivation. Emily Carter continued walking through the city streets at a steady and composed pace, her posture relaxed, her expression calm, moving naturally among pedestrians who were unaware of the layered federal processes that had concluded only moments earlier in system time. Behind her, the municipal enforcement units had fully disengaged from active response mode, their devices now displaying finalized closure status confirming that all authority transitions had been completed and that no further field-level actions were authorized. Detective Mark Reynolds had already returned to standard operational direction, standing near his patrol unit briefly before moving away, his attention no longer on the resolved incident but on routine procedural duties that now occupied his shift, the earlier encounter reduced to a finalized entry within secure records. Captain Laura Mitchell had similarly exited the immediate vicinity, rejoining standard municipal command flow with full acknowledgement that federal clearance validation had permanently superseded all prior local enforcement assumptions regarding the case. Inside federal archival systems, the complete sequence of events had finished final synchronization, locking all communication logs, identity verification data, and jurisdictional override confirmations into a secured repository designed for high-level clearance incidents, ensuring permanent classification stability with no active processing threads remaining. Emily passed through a wider downtown intersection where traffic lights cycled normally and pedestrians continued their daily routines, her presence now indistinguishable from the surrounding crowd, as if the entire sequence of institutional escalation had existed in a separate layer of reality that no longer intersected with visible public life. The environment showed no physical trace of the procedural transformation that had occurred, yet within structured data systems, every action, update, and confirmation had already been recorded and finalized as part of a completed federal verification resolution. Detective Reynolds finally entered his vehicle and closed the door, his posture neutral, his focus returned fully to standard municipal duties, while the internal classification of the incident remained accessible only through restricted archival channels. Captain Mitchell had already moved beyond the operational zone, her role in the incident fully concluded, with all required acknowledgements submitted confirming procedural closure and jurisdictional transfer completion. Emily continued forward along the sidewalk until she merged completely into the flow of city movement, no longer subject to observation or procedural tracking, her figure blending seamlessly into the broader urban environment. Within federal systems, the final audit confirmation had already completed its last verification cycle, marking the case as permanently closed under classified jurisdictional review, leaving behind only structured records that preserved the entire sequence as a finalized institutional event with no remaining operational presence.